Lessee enters into a 10-year lease for 5,000 square meters of office space. The annual lease payments are rupees 1 lakh payable at the end of each year. The interest rate implicit in the lease cannot be readily determined. Lessee's incremental borrowing rate at the commencement date is 6% per annum. So there is a 10-year lease. So we have entered into a 10-year lease. It is for 5,000 square meters of office space, and our annual lease payments are a lakh of rupees. And we are paying this at the end of each year. They are saying that the rate of interest implicit in the lease is not readily available, and that is the reason we are using the incremental rate of borrowing of lessee as the discount rate, which is turning out to be 6%. Okay. Then they are saying at the beginning of year 7. Beginning of year 7 is as good as the end of the 6th year. Lessee and the lessor agree to amend the original lease by extending the contractual lease term by 4 years. Okay. So they have given us a case of lease extension at the beginning of year 7, or we can say at the end of the 6th year. So 6 years have already gone by. So 4 years are left, isn't it? 4 years are left. But we have decided to extend it by another 4 years. So we are adding another 4 years of lease term. Now, from the end of the 6th year, the lease will continue for another 8 years. That is what they say. They are saying that it has been extended by 4 years. Okay. The annual lease payments are unchanged. The lease rent is not changing. The lease rent was 1 lakh rupees earlier. It is remaining 1 lakh only. And again, it will be paid at the end of each year from year 7 to 14. Right? There's 8 years. This 8 years is nothing but year 7 to 14. Okay. Lessee's incremental rate of borrowing at the beginning of year 7 is 7%. If you are doing accounting for the modification, then now it makes sense that originally you were considering 6%, but when I will do modification, now I will consider 7%. How should the said modification be accounted for? So this will fall into a case where there is no increase in the scope. So what will happen over here is we will not be treating this as a separate lease. So that question is already ruled out. So the way we will have to solve this question is we will have to remeasure the lease liability. See, the lease term has changed. Since the lease term has changed, your liability of making the payments has also undergone a change. So we should remeasure the lease liability. And once you have remeasured the lease liability, adjustments in the lease liability should be made through the ROU asset. I'll show you that. Here it is. The case that we are doing, let me just clear this thing a bit. This is what we are discussing, right? This is where it is falling. Increase in the lease term. This is the case that we are solving. What should you do? Remeasure the lease liability and make corresponding adjustment to the ROU asset. How that will be done? That's what we will study now. First, let's work out the original liability. Measurement of initial lease liability. Measurement of initial lease liability. Here, lease payments. Originally, the discount rate was 6%. The lease term was for 10 years. Lease payment is 1 lakh. Count it. So your original lease liability is 7,36,000. Now we are modifying this lease agreement at the beginning of the 7th year, that is at the end of the 6th year. So we should find out what is the carrying amount of the lease liability in our books. See, we are supposed to remeasure the lease liability. I can remeasure the lease liability only if I know what is its carrying amount. And I will require the carrying amount on the date of modification. See, we should find out that on the date of modification, what is the lease liability as per the original terms. Then we will find out what is the lease liability on the date of modification as per the revised terms. And then the two lease liabilities will be compared. Again, I repeat, if you have missed out, on the date of modification, you should find out what is the carrying amount of the original lease liability on the date of modification. Similarly, on the date of modification, find out that what is the lease liability as per the revised terms. I will compare the lease liability as per original terms with as per the revised terms, and the difference between the two is the adjustment to be made. Getting it? So let's get the carrying amount of the original lease liability. Determination of carrying amount of original lease liability on date of modification. On date of modification, that is beginning of 7th year, that is at end of 6th year. Okay. We will prepare a loan repayment schedule, a lease liability repayment schedule, and find out what is the carrying amount. Prepare the table. Amount at the end, that's what we want. If you are still writing, just pause the video here and complete it. Introduce 6 years in your calculation. Although the lease is for originally 10 years, but I will not do calculation for 10 years. I simply want the balance on the date of modification, right? That's the reason. Lease payments, you already know. It will be 1 lakh. So I am introducing 1 lakh from the very beginning. So start with 7,36,000 into 6 percent. 44,160, 780, 160, 680, 160. So we are ready with the schedule, and we realize that at the end of the 6th year or at the beginning of the 7th year, the time when you are modifying the lease, the carrying amount of the lease liability as per the original lease term is 3,46,499. If you are still writing, just pause the video here and complete it. Let's understand the modification now. Yes. They are saying that we are extending it by 4 years. We have already made it clear here that now the lease will be for 8 years. There is no change in the lease rent. The lease rent will still remain 1 lakh. But the discount rate which you were originally using at 6%, it has got updated to 7%. So this will give you the modified lease liability. Consider it to be a fresh lease. Just think for a moment that it's a fresh lease that you are signing at the beginning of the 7th year. If you are signing a fresh lease at the beginning of the 7th year, then we will argue that this is a lease for 8 years, where the rent will be 1 lakh and where the discount rate will be 7%. Using that, I will find out what is the modified lease liability. We say, after all that you have done, we'll say measurement of modified lease liability. Yes. Should be lease payment, sorry. Again, I am repeating, at the beginning of the 7th year, you are extending the lease by 4 years. At the beginning of 7th year, 4 years are still left. Another 4 years, so now total 8 years. So we are calculating in this way, that if this is a fresh lease, let's say you are signing the lease agreement for the very first time, then it will be a lease for 8 years. Rent is 1 lakh, but at that time, the discount rate is 7%. So I'm using 7%. Let's work out the cumulative present value factor. $5.971, right? So this will give me 5,97,100. 597,100. So your lease liability as per the original terms is 3,46,499, right? This is it. It is 3,46,499. This 346,499 is now to be updated to 597,100. So this is the change that you will be introducing in the lease liability, and this change will be adjusted through the ROU asset. We'll say effect of lease modification. Effect of lease modification. Modified lease liability. Modified lease liability. 5,97,100 less original lease liability on date of modification, right? Both of them are on the date of the modification, isn't it? 346,499. $2,50,601. We'll say adjusted to ROU asset. Just pause the video here if you are still doing it. They haven't asked for it, but we can propose an accounting entry. Okay. We can suggest an accounting entry over here. What do you say? What can be the accounting entry? The lease liability is increasing, so lease liability will be credited. What shall be debited? What shall be debited? We are saying adjusted to ROU asset, so ROU asset will be debited. ROU asset account debit 2,50,601 to lease liability account, to lease liability account 250,601. That's the end of our answer.